Hi, Dr. Buke. How are you
Hello.
today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yeah. So I would love for you just to introduce yourself, tell us more about you, both professionally and personally, and anything you think would be helpful for our viewers to know, our viewers, for our listeners to know.
Yeah, I I am a psychologist and really kind of a very specifically holistic mental wellness psychologist. And um, let me backtrack a little bit. I'm a person, right? So I'm human, and I hold um, some identities that are very near and dear to me that I think also tie into our conversation today. But I am um, a Black Dominican and someone who also migrated to the US when she was young. I was 5 years old when I did, and I identify as woman, cis. So, kind of a lot of those identities really, tie into the formation of who I am personally and professionally. And so, like, fast forward to that, right? Like, I've become a psychologist and someone who focuses on intergenerational trauma and on holistic mental health and just really on healing my people.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Well, I came across, I think, an interview that you had, or a podcast interview that you had done, and really appreciated your insight. And, I think probably more than anything, your groundedness. So
Mhm.
I am so grateful to have you on here to talk about this topic. I think this is something that comes up a lot. I think specifically among people of color, specifically BIPOC women that we've spoken to or that I've spoken to in the course of my time doing these interviews, and just in my own personal life, right? My own experience with
Mhm.
the way that intergenerational trauma has impacted me. I think then, thus impacts my family. Um, and how it's played out, or how we've talked about this just in my own personal life and personal settings, and then just how it shows up professionally for me as a therapist. But I would
Mhm.
love just to start with a, a what is the definition? What would be the most uh, tangible definition of intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, so the most tangible and the one that I've held on to for the sake of, kind of, I guess, relaying to the public is this intergenerational trauma is the type of trauma that really lies at the intersection of nature and nurture, right? Like we have a bunch of theories and psychology that really kind of intersect at that intersection, and intergenerational trauma happens to be one of those as well. And the reason being is because a part of the experience is one in which there is a transmission of trauma factors that happen both in the genetic realm and then also in the social realm. And then in the genetic realm, it's more so situated in gene expressions and the ways in which a traumatized parent or a parent living with trauma has with the experience of chronic trauma and the ways in which the body reacts to trauma, most notably in the ways that the body then produces an overproduction of stress hormones as a result of the ongoing trauma that that parent would likely be undergoing throughout their lifetime and lifespan. It makes it so that their gene expressions kind of um, become different and variable over time to accommodate for the ways in which those hormones are flowing through their bodies. And so that very mechanism of high stress hormones and the ways in which they get basically recorded into the genes, that gets then transmitted in the belly when a baby is forming. And so and we have, kind of like the biology of it all. But then the nurture side is really kind of everything that happens after, someone is earthside,
Mhm.
and all the multiple stressors that a person can experience, especially given that they will now have a vulnerability that they carry with them, a stress vulnerability. all the multiple experiences, particularly those that, person experiences on an ongoing basis, like those that people experience by way of being marginalized people, is something that then meets them, kind of on an ongoing basis through life and creates a greater propensity for the experience of trauma.
I love that. I love this idea of it's sitting at the intersection of nature and nurture,
Hmm.
and all the biological factors that play into the expression of that, right? And the
Right.
vulnerability of that. And then the way that I conceptualize it is how our adaptations, or our parents' adaptations to those stress factors, impact the way that they are able to be parents.
Hmm.
And then layered on top of that, again, like you said, for marginalized peoples, how all of those factors then impact, the adaptations and vulnerabilities that come up for them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, like a lot of what is a part of trauma is not only, what directly happens to us and an acute stressor, what happens to us, but just those day-to-day experiences that we have that are sometimes even modeled, right? Modeled ways of engaging with stress, modeled ways of engaging with perceived threat, right?
Yep. Yep.
All of those things that if we have um, a parent who themselves is internally preoccupied and having a way of it, kind of externalizing behavior and words that mirror their internal experience, like a lot of that will get soaked up by the young mind.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I'm curious. I think that in a conversation that I was having with some friends, they had the question around what is the you see it within a family structure, within a family system, that there are some people, or some people within that system, that can be more impacted than others, right? For some reason. And there's so many reasons why that occurs. But I think sometimes there's a way that we don't quite understand how these transmissions happen, right? Like how maybe one person in a family can be impacted, and then another may not be as impacted. Um, and so then it's hard, I think, for people to really truly understand what intergenerational trauma is, right? What is the true impact of that, not only on the individual, but on the family system.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really it's hard, right? It's hard to identify just as much as it is, with non-intergenerational types of traumas. Like we're still trying to wrap our heads around what it is that makes the difference between one person undergoing a similar circumstance as another and having a very different kind of reaction, right? One person developing PTSD versus another person not.
Right.
And one person, reflecting PTSD in a specific way versus someone reflecting it in a completely different way. And it's like there's a lot of variability in humanness, right? Like in who we are and temperament. They're very a marker of a specific trait that we're just kind of innately born with, right? Like there's so many things that
Mhm.
we have yet to understand and consider in the grand scheme of things when it comes to, why does trauma look different person to person, even within one home,
Mhm.
that I think, factors into also the ways in which intergenerational trauma could look so different for different people.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I think also the ways that all of our identities probably intersect with you know all of those components, right?
Yeah, yeah,
um, and I think more specifically, and I would love for you to speak to this both professionally and personally, how these I think that we talk a lot on this podcast about um, how specific traumas show up, how sometimes our adaptations, although they can be create challenges for us, they can also be ways that are very helpful for us to
hmm
become successful, right? But I'm curious, just in terms of how you see specifically BIPOC women, kind of the expression of how intergenerational trauma can impact the individual in very practical ways, and maybe how you've seen that show up in your own life.
yeah. You know, um, in part, kind of like the